An important story has broken for which very few people even realize was occurring. And it's with regards to a bit of work being done by the ACIP in the US looking at vaccine injuries. I'm going to cover that in just a second. But it's a really important point because very few people understand that COVID vaccine injury, outside of myocarditis, which has largely been accepted, and in terms of the AstraZeneca, the VITT, there are a few things that have been accepted by the scientific community. But what we have is a significant number of people who are suffering with long term illness and have largely been ignored. And what has happened is that the industry has preferred to say that this is a rare issue, and therefore there is no need for any significant further investigation. This was being challenged by the ACIP. So, this here is the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices in the US, and they were looking specifically at COVID 19 immunization, a work group, and this was about vaccine chronic injuries and a proposed action. This was confidential, not for distribution, but somehow it got leaked. And what they were proposing was that they wanted a formal ICD code. And what that means is that with almost every illness, there is a coding so that if someone has it, you can then see numbers. And if you can see numbers, you can then raise awareness and look at research. At the moment, what is happening is that everything is a bit nebulous. Nobody quite knows what's going on. People have long term injuries. It doesn't seem to matter too much. They don't know where to go. We do have some clinics, but there is no formal setup. What is causing the problem is that it seems that many of the people on this immunization work group and in the ACIP generally are linked with what would be considered an anti vaccine kind of view. I know Christine Stabel Ben, however, is a very much a pro vaxxer, but asks difficult questions. So you can imagine her being on this committee is going to cause problems. But you look through the group, one of the challenges that was coming up was that it wasn't balanced enough. I'd interviewed Dr. Robert Malone very early on. He has had a lot of work, a lot of insight into the industry, and he was one of the very critical creators originally in the context of mRNA vaccines. There's a lot of argument about that. The main point being, when I interviewed him, it was very clear that he had some of the very earliest thoughts about it, and it was a problem because he then spoke out in the COVID pandemic. So he became persona non grata. But he was recognized as being relevant in terms of industry and has got himself up to the highest levels in terms of guiding the country in the US as to what happens. But here is the reality. This document that was not supposed to have been shared ended up in the public domain. And here are some of the points that they looked at. In a recent public survey, over a third of those acknowledged to be vaccinated against COVID 19 reported that they had experienced side effects. Now, I want you to pause on this here a minute before I go any further, because you will remember that people were told that if you feel unwell after you had been vaccinated, that's a good sign because it means the immune system is working. I don't think so. I think that if this was part of a research trial, you would document any adverse event, whether or not it's lymphadenopathy, feeling flu like symptoms, you would document minor to major. And I don't think that it was necessarily good science to tell people that this meant the immune system was working well. Because the reality is that anyone who studies severe COVID, especially, realizes that it is primarily about immune dysregulation. And so anything that could promote immune dysregulation in the context of spike protein exposure, for me, is a red flag. And so, in that sense, you would expect that there, therefore, could indicate longer term people who had experienced negative effects could have been having adverse, significant longer term effects. I'll come back to that in a minute. But here is what the document pointed out. They said 10% of those reported major side effects. And in another public survey, 24% of the participants reported that they knew someone who died from the adverse effects of COVID vaccination. That is significant. Now, whether or not the public is right, this indicates that the public, almost a quarter of people, suspect that there are far more significant adverse events that are occurring in the population than has been acknowledged. So, this is a very important point. And when we put this, and when I put it to the scientific community, what I would say is forget your ideology for a minute. This is what the public is thinking. And you can't absolutely say that they are wrong because we've never actually done thorough investigations, especially through autopsy, to really understand what the longer term implications are. So I think the public does have a right to ask questions. Now, what happened is that a lawsuit or court filing was put forward to challenge the people who were on the ACIP, the advisory committee. Now, it's important to note that this challenge was put out. So, this is the District Court of Massachusetts. This was put out in, I have the date down here, in July, I think, as I roll through. There it is. Plaintiffs filed suit on the 7th of July, 2025. And they initially challenged the fact that Secretary Kennedy, in the 27th of May, 2025, recommended that pregnant women and healthy children no longer recommending the COVID vaccine. And so this is what triggered this legal challenge. It just so happens that recently the legal challenge has gotten through, and it means that it has potentially going to impact on this working group. So you can see here, this is Dr. Malone who mentioned something about it. There was some confusion, but it was further, as it says, were thrown into further disarray this week as the outspoken member, that's Dr. Malone, on the advisory committee. They were saying whose appointment was invalidated by a federal judge on Monday, declared that the group was being disbanded before later correcting his claim. What happened is that one of the thoughts that they had at the time was that the easiest way to address this legal challenge was to disband the group and then reappoint people and just set it up again. Now, what was then fixed in terms of the statements here is that some 5 hours later, so this was just this week, Malone posted again to explain that the information he'd received was a miscommunication, noting that in fact the decision about how to proceed had not been made, and dissolving and reforming remains one of the options being considered. So, this is what's going on in the background. And you may think that this is just another one of those issues floating around in the ether of the scientific community. But here is the point: if we don't start to acknowledge that vaccine injuries may be far more significant than had been thought, you have no opportunity for mitigation. So, in the past week, I'd done a very important presentation when I had done an analysis in 2022, and this was my analysis, looking at Office of National Statistics data in the UK, looking at vaccination status and mortality, specifically non COVID mortality. One of the groups that stood out were people who only had one vaccine. They had the worst mortality outcomes, non COVID mortality, as well as COVID, actually, worse than the unvaccinated. So, the question that I had asked then, and I am asking it again in relation to this work that should have been done or was going to be done, is did these individuals who only took one dose of the two-dose vaccines only take it or only take one dose because they had an adverse event? Now, some people just didn't bother, and that's fine. But what if we found that 90% of those people who only took a single dose did so because they had a significant adverse event. The reason this is important is because I was highlighting that this should be a public health issue. I would expect that when this data, because I reanalyzed the data in the past few weeks and it was as clear as a bell, this time again using AI to look through all the data, and it was clear across almost all the cohorts, especially so in the younger cohorts, 18 to 39, the non-COVID mortality, that means that people who died not related to COVID-19, was highest in those who had a single dose. So, what I would expect to happen is that the public health should take this kind of data, go back through the records, find everybody who had only one dose and check what was your reason for only having one dose? Did you have a significant adverse effect? And then plot their health trajectory. Because we could be talking, as I said, when we look at the data, and this is not me making it up. This is what was written in this working document, and you can see it here. They suspect that 10% of people had major side effects at some point. Now, a proportion of them would be one dose, some people after two doses, some people after three doses. And look at this, 24% of a public survey think they know someone who died from the adverse effects of COVID vaccination. Now, look carefully. This is a working group. This is from the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices work group. This is what they were going to be discussing until the court case came up, which was blocking them in the past week from technically dismantling this work group. Now, I understand that some people would be unhappy about some of the recommendations that were being made, but the reality is that it is going to do significant damage to the very important question of trying to understand what was happening or what is happening to a proportion of the population who seem to have had negative effects and are potentially still having ongoing effects. And remember, there's only one part of the cohort because some people never made the connection. They had adverse effects within probably 28 days of being vaccinated, and they just completely forgot that they were vaccinated. And so they never connected this adverse effect to the fact that they were recently vaccinated. These are significant points, and it is not anti vaccine to ask this. I think the greatest damage that has been done to trust overall in vaccines has been the approach of the scientific and medical community to ignore the public, to effectively gaslight them and tell them that what they are seeing or what they are thinking is not relevant. I mean, we can't win in this situation. So, as the final point here, I want you to think about this. In a public survey, 24% of the participants, and even if you think the survey wasn't done properly, let's pull it down to 15% or even 10%. 1 in 10 people think they know someone who died from the adverse effect of a COVID vaccine, and you don't want to investigate this? And this is not at the top and center of your priority to clarify what is going on? And then you wonder why people are no longer taking other vaccines. And when people are talking about side effects of other vaccines, the public then listen to it because they have lost faith and trust in the system that has not asked the questions that they would have expected. This is the reality of where we are. I don't think there's anywhere to hide this. There is a responsibility, whether or not people have an ideological view or they're following a narrative or they just think that 24% of the public are just ridiculous. They are still your public. You still have to listen to them and you still have to prove to them that they haven't been harmed. Misinformation goes both ways. And I think the failure to investigate is probably one of the most dangerous ones by pretending there are no problems. Thank you for listening. And just a reminder that coming up in the next few days, the rising heart crisis, why cardiovascular disease is surging. If you're interested, click on the link in the description. I'll be looking at some of the data, looking at hospital episode statistics and what is surging, why it may be surging, and the implications on the trajectory for the future. Look forward to sharing more information with you in the near future. Have a great evening.